welcome to Anomicon 2025. My name is Sheanna Steingass, and I am a marine scientist and lover of folklore as well. And today I'm going to talk to you about maritime mysteries, both haunted and haunting. I myself have spent a fair amount of time on the world's oceans, primarily the Pacific, and have a lore of the mysteries that lie beneath those bodies of water. Sea travel today is no less dramatic than it was 200 years ago, but it is indeed much safer, and that's thanks to the explorers and locals that navigated these waters without the advantage of modern technology. So when Ryan asked me to present today, I instantly thought it would be perfect to talk about ghost ships and the sea and ghostly shipwrecks. I personally was imagining finding a lot of stories of ghostly pirates delivering bad omens or stories about ghost sightings at sea. And instead, what my research found was a lot more haunting than those visions, so to say. My talk today is about true mysteries, the kind of mysteries that can collectively haunt societies for hundreds of years. They're the kind of mysteries that can only happen in the true wilderness with uncharted maps and no witness except for the ocean itself. The stories that we're going to talk about today are truly stranger than fiction, and they have persisted for not just weeks or months, but in some cases over 150 years without any answers. We're going to focus on the Arctic today. It is one of the most desolate and unpredictable places on our planet. It is a place of both incredible life and incredible darkness. Winters there are long and sunless. Temperatures can drop below -50 degrees Fahrenheit, and Arctic winds can rage at over 150 miles per hour. Even today, with all of our technology, it's an incredibly challenging place to be. But back in the 16th and 17th centuries, it was a nearly impassable barrier that captured the imagination and obsession of European explorers. For hundreds of years, European explorers set out to solve an impossible problem: how to trade goods from the Asian continent without having to undertake the perilous routes around the Cape of Good Hope. So literally thousands of ships, including today, have sunk navigating around the southern tip of the African continent en route from Asia to the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, the Cape was originally named the Cape of Storms in 1488, but later King John II of Portugal decided it needed a bit of a PR upgrade, and it was renamed the Cape of Good Hope. Despite all this optimism, the route is known for its violent storms, and if something were found across the Atlantic and west through the Arctic, ships could save hundreds or thousands of miles on their journey to buy and trade goods, and this conceptual passage became known as the Northwest Passage. And so governments became obsessed with it, and they funded mass expeditions of navigators, sea captains, scientists, and military officers to explore the unexplored. And so many famous expeditions, including the Cook expedition, sailed into frozen waters to both delineate maps and find new resources for their governments. Early ocean explorers to the North American continent experienced a completely blank map. Now imagine that. As each individual expedition proceeded and then failed, the map did gain a little bit more detail over the centuries. However, this passage itself remained elusive. Due to these collective efforts, more and more coastline became mapped over time, but by the mid-1800s, nobody had yet succeeded in finding a thoroughfare through the Arctic. And this is where the Franklin expedition comes into the limelight. In 1845, it would become one of maritime history's most enduring mysteries and has some incredible and unexpected ties to U.S. history as well. The ships were well provisioned. The Erebus and the Terror were specially equipped with central heating via a stove. Their bows were reinforced with steel to cut through the sea ice, and each boat had a steam engine and a screw propeller. Provisions for 3 years were very impressive and included 8,000 large soldered tins of meat and fat, over 32,000 pounds of salted beef and pork, 36,000 pounds of biscuits, 3,600 gallons of spirits, and 4,900 gallons of ale. My personal favorite was the 9,400 pounds of chocolate, the 10 live oxen included for meat, and 200 gallons of quote-unquote wine for the sick. And so here we are along the north coast of North America. Franklin set off and traveled by Greenland and into the interior of Newfoundland in 1845. He overwintered at Beechy Island, shown in the circle here, and made some short progress in the summer of 1846. And then he became beset in the sea ice off of King William Island in September of 1846 for a year and a half. So let's think about that. From September 1846 until April of 1848, these men sat in the frigid Arctic with no way to contact the outside world. They became overtaken by pneumonia and tuberculosis and plagued by a terrible disease that we know today as scurvy. Scurvy is truly an awful disease. Luckily, we don't experience it much today, but it is brought on by a deficiency of vitamin C. And as you can imagine in the Arctic, where there are no fresh fruits or vegetables, that is very hard to come by. Now, while native Alaskans and folks in the Arctic have ways of nutritionally making sense of this, European crews didn't really understand many alternatives. So this expedition brought along lemon juice, and it's believed that that lemon juice actually fermented, and the result was scurvy. So crew members became incredibly weak and delirious, and they began to develop sores and bruises on their skin. And perhaps most disturbingly, those heavily impacted by scurvy start to have bleeding gums and tooth loss over time. So not only was this crew marooned in a really terrible environment, they were incredibly weak. And Franklin himself passed away in June 1847 for unknown reasons. And while we believe that Franklin was buried on King William Island, no records exist and his body has never been found. His crew remained there for another grueling year until the 105 remaining crew members out of the original 129 decided that they would try and trek towards what is now known as the Canadian mainland for rescue. So on Good Friday in April of 1888, they took off and quickly discovered that they were not well equipped for overland travel. They really didn't have the appropriate materials despite being well equipped for sea. They had to manufacture their own sleds. They didn't have eye protection for the glare off of the sea ice and the water. And they really didn't have shelters or layers or anything for survival. It was a really tough journey. And that's when the first ghostly tales come to us from the Inuit people who inhabited the area around King William Island. So although the island itself wasn't uninhabited, there weren't any villages nearby where the shipwreck was marooned. However, there were encounters as transient hunters came across the crew. And years later, when questioned by rescue missions, the Netsiluk Inuit described eerie encounters with emaciated, pale-faced men dragging sleds across the ice, their faces blackened by frostbite. It was these testimonies by local Inuit that actually helped discover the fate of the expedition. And at this point, across the world, people became obsessed. More than 40 rescue expeditions were launched in search of Franklin. One piece of evidence surfaced in 1858, a note that was found just south of Victory Point on the northwest coast of King William Island. And you can see the note here. It describes crew's plans to walk to the Back River on what is now known as the Canadian continent. Other expeditions made contact with local Inuit people who described their encounters with the crew, and they became convinced of the veracity of these stories when they were presented by small relics of the expedition. Meanwhile, across the world in England and actually in the US as well, one of my favorite historical eras was brewing, and that was the spiritualist movement. Spiritualism dominated higher society and popular culture from about this time period until the 1920s. Many fields of scientific inquiry were in their infancy, including medicine, navigation, communication, and meteorology or weather prediction. This made the world a much more deadly, but also more mysterious place to live in. And the real risks of mortality also drove interest in traversing the gap between the living and the dead. And so with that, I can introduce a very unique explorer named William Parker Snow. Snow was not only a well-traveled explorer, but he had a bit of a reputation. He was often getting caught up in unfortunate mishaps and seemed to be incredibly hard to work with. And I expect that probably describes a lot of early explorers, but Snow is unique in that he was also part of the spiritualist movement, and he became incredibly obsessed with the Franklin expedition itself. In January of 1850, while working as a reporter in New York City, Snow had a vivid dream or vision where he saw the missing Franklin expedition locked in the icy waters of the high Arctic. He was so moved by this vision, he wrote Lady Franklin and actually convinced her, based on a psychic dream, to sponsor him on a rescue mission on the vessel the Prince Albert shown here. It was ultimately unsuccessful, who would have known, but it was one of at least a dozen famous incidents of psychic visions of the Lost Franklin expedition. This is one of his actual paintings, and I think that perhaps the biggest failing of Snow was the vagueness of his vision. If you think about it, being locked in sea ice somewhere in the Arctic is almost a continental level problem. And that being said, we aren't done with Mr. Snow quite yet, but we're going to move on a little bit. There were many recovery voyages that were launched to try and rescue the Franklin expedition, one of which was the HMS Investigator. The Investigator was commanded by Robert McClure and traveled via the Bering Strait on the west side on an attempt to search for the Franklin expedition from the Pacific. Now, they didn't make it particularly far and actually ended up on the west coast of Canada, trapped in the sea ice for 3 years. Now, the crew eventually abandoned the ship and were rescued, but the most interesting thing about the Investigator is that it continued to drift in the sea ice for 160 years. The Investigator is a true case of a ghost ship because of its ability to navigate the ocean without a crew. Now, eventually it seemed to disappear, but believe it or not, in 2010, the Investigator was actually found. Parks Canada found the Investigator at the shallow water of Mercy Bay, and it was nearly intact. So, believe it or not, this ship drifted for probably decades and ended up very close to where it started. The HMS Resolute was another rescue expedition sent off to find Franklin and his men. Now, you may not be surprised to learn that the HMS Resolute was trapped in sea ice and abandoned in 1854. But the truly remarkable thing about the Resolute is that it drifted over 1,200 miles unmanned until it was discovered by an American whaler 2 years later. And the Resolute itself has a pretty amazing history after its rediscovery. Here you can see an image of the HMS Resolute and its men abandoning it off the sea ice there. And this looks very similar to what we expect happened with the Franklin expedition itself. But taking a step back from Franklin and his rescue missions, there was actually a mysterious vessel that navigated the Northwest Passage itself as a ghost ship. And this occurred via the HMS Octavius, which was said to be discovered west of Greenland in 1775. Now, the Octavius was an interesting story because it was docked in London and took on a cargo destined for China. Now, the sailing ship left port with a full crew, including the skipper and his wife and son. They arrived safely in China and unloaded their cargo and headed back to sea once it was loaded with goods for Britain. Now, the captain decided the weather seemed unusually mild, I suppose, and thought that he would sail home via the undiscovered Northwest Passage, a voyage that had not been successfully undertaken by anybody at this point. And this was the last that anyone heard of her crew or her cargo for quite a while, and it was declared lost. Now, in October of 1775, a whaling ship was working in the frigid waters off of Greenland when it discovered a sailing ship. And it went over to investigate and started to note that the sails were tattered, the boat wasn't maintained, and something seemed horribly wrong. So they actually tried to climb aboard. And when they did, they discovered some pretty horrific sights. Now, the whaling crew climbed aboard and they found the very disturbing sight of the entire 28-man crew frozen to death in their quarters. They said they found the ship's captain still at his desk, as shown in this illustration here, frozen with his pen in his hand with an unfinished logbook entry. They also found the captain's wife and son frozen to death, and based on the last entry and where the ship was found, it was discovered that the Octavius actually transversed the Northwest Passage on its own as a ghost ship. And as you can imagine, this spurred a lot of legends about the Octavius and has made it one of the most popular and well-known ghost ships in the Arctic. Now, we're going to step out of time a little bit and move ahead to 1931 because I think this is a great example of how the Arctic, even though technology advanced, is still in a lot of ways an impassable place. So the SS Beijamo left Sweden for Alaska in search of furs, and it unsurprisingly became trapped in pack ice. This crew was a little bit more fortunate in that they were able to abandon the ship and travel about a half of a mile to the village of Barrow, Alaska, to take shelter for a couple of days. When they came back, the ship had actually broken free and was now in a different location. Well, at this point, the Hudson Bay Company sent aircraft to retrieve about 22 members of the crew, and 15 stayed behind to watch the ship, because you have to remember there's a lot of money and economic interest in this vessel. So they constructed a wooden shelter some distance away to keep an eye on it, and in November, there was a massive blizzard. After a few days, the blizzard abated, and the Beishamo was gone. So the captain concluded that she must have broken up and sunk in the storm. However, a few days later, a seal hunter reported that they had seen the Beishamo about 45 miles away from the original position. The 15 men proceeded to track the ship down and, deciding that it was unlikely to survive the winter, returned home after retrieving the most valuable furs from the hold. The Beishamo was then abandoned. And the interesting thing about this ship is that it remained in the Arctic and became known as the ghost ship of the Arctic. It was reportedly sighted adrift for 38 years, all the way into 1969. And until that point, it was also known as the Ship of the Dead. And a local legend said that when the northern lights shimmered green, you could see the Beishamo dancing along the Arctic with its masts and riggings flowing in the wind. It was taken as a bad omen to see the Bechamel, and after about 1969, it disappeared forever. Now, today, the Northwest Passage exists in a way it didn't in the 1800s. Large amounts of sea ice have melted almost permanently, making the Arctic much more passable. Developing science and technology has also allowed agencies like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to map the seafloor with unprecedented detail, preventing future disasters like we've talked about, but also making the Arctic more available for commerce. Now, let's go back to our favorite sea captain, William Parker Snow. While relics from the Franklin expedition have been recovered, including the mummified and frozen remains of several men of the expedition, I didn't include those photos because they are quite disturbing, but if you want to learn more about the Franklin expedition, I would recommend doing so because it's truly fascinating. That being said, this is where our US history comes into play a little bit here, and that's thanks to Captain Snow. So, in April of 1865, the New York Herald ran the following article. Captain Parker Snow, the distinguished commander of the Arctic and Antarctic exploring expeditions, presented to General Dix with a view of their being interred in the coffin of the President, Abraham Lincoln, some interesting relics of Sir John Franklin's ill-fated expedition. They consisted of a tattered leaf of a prayer book, on which the first word legible was the word martyr, and a piece of fringe and some portions of uniform. These suggestive relics, which are soon to be buried out of sight, were found in a boat lying under the head of a human skeleton. So that is to say that John Parker Snow was so convinced that Abraham Lincoln should have relics from the Franklin expedition buried with him that he took some items that were found underneath a skeleton and successfully advocated to bury them in the coffin with Lincoln, and they are still there today. Now, you might be wondering whatever happened to the fate of those two vessels, and I am happy to report that, believe it or not, in 2014, the HMS Erebus was actually found with sonar by a Parks Canada expedition off the coast of King William Island. So let's think about this. These explorations were so famous that they had over 40 rescue missions sent to them in the 1800s. Despite the development of commerce and trade in the Pacific and Arctic through the next century, they remained undiscovered. And it wasn't until 2014 that we had the proper technology to find and not even recover, but just study these vessels. It actually took a couple extra years before the HMS Terror was found, and it was found by the Arctic Research Foundation in September after being lost for over 160 years. And one of the most sought after seafaring mysteries in the world sat in the ocean for 160 years. So if this is the case, imagine what mysteries still remain beneath the oceans that we haven't even begun to look for. And there is one more very important relic of the Franklin expedition that has become a key part of US history. And this is a desk that we all might recognize. Now, this symbol of our national history is actually under refurbishment, quote unquote, as of 2025. I'm not sure what that means. So that being said, I wanted to read from you the inscription on the desk itself. It says the HMS Resolute, forming part of the expedition sent in search of Sir John Franklin, was abandoned on 15th of May, 1854. She was discovered and extricated in September of 1855 by Captain Buddington of the United States whaler George Henry. The HMS Resolute was purchased, refurbished, and fitted out and sent to England as a gift to Her Majesty the Queen Victoria by the President and people of the United States as a token of goodwill and friendship. This table, or desk, made from her timbers when she was broken up and presented by Great Britain and Ireland to the President of the United States as a memorial of the loving kindness which dictates the offer of the HMS Resolute, the ship that was originally gifted. Now, this is all well and good, but if it weren't at least a little bit spooky, I wouldn't have included it. And the amazing thing about the Resolute desk, this piece of American and British and exploration history, has been really a center point for American diplomacy, international policy, in advancing science and technology for decades. Well, it's actually a haunted desk, and it's known as the desk that whispers. And so it's said that some US presidents have felt sudden drafts in the room or even heard whispering in the grain of the wood itself. Staff have sworn in the quiet hours a chill runs through the room and papers flutter though no window is open. And if you press your ear to the wood, you might just hear the murmured voices of the lost expeditions of the Arctic. Now, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I want to say thank you so much to Ryan Sprague and everyone involved in Anomicon, including our MC, Jim Harold, for allowing me to present to you today. I had a lot of fun with this talk, and I hope that you both learned some things and got some good chills. If you want to hear more about what I do, you are welcome to find me on LinkedIn. I'm not a huge social media user, but you can find me on Instagram and Threads as at Marine Cowgirl. And in addition, if you want to see me investigate sea monsters and ocean mysteries and delve into the science of those types of things, you can find me on History Channel's The Proof is Out There. And with that, I hope you really enjoy the rest of this wonderful event.